The 1692 Salem witch trials still fascinate the American public, but the real story is far more complicated than what we think we know. Here are some major misconceptions about the Salem witch trials. The image of witches being burned at the stake is widespread, but it's a myth when it comes to Salem. Most convicted witches in America and England were hanged. It was only in Scotland that burnings occurred, but even there it was only to dead bodies. The convicted had usually been strangled first.
We have found the witch! May we burn her? Who do you know she is a witch? She looks like one!
In Salem, the town's makeshift gallows, a tree, saw the hanging of over a dozen individuals, including Sarah Good, Elizabeth Howell, Susanna Martin, Rebecca Nurse, and Sarah Wilds, all in one day in 1692. George Burroughs, a minister accused of being a witch's ringleader, recited the Lord's Prayer before his execution, something thought impossible for a wizard or witch. Onlookers began to question his guilt. Their doubt was quashed by Cotton Mather, a noted intellectual and supporter of the trials. After hanging, the bodies were dropped into a shallow crevice below, where their grief-stricken families could secretly collect them. As they were considered handmaidens of Satan, none of the accused were allowed to be buried in consecrated ground. However, it is believed that at least 3 of the convicted, Rebecca Nurse, John Proctor, and George Jacobs, were collected by their families and given Christian burials. Many of the accused were older and more vulnerable women in the community who were being targeted by young girls, including 9-year-old Elizabeth Parris and her 11-year-old cousin Abigail Williams, whose testimonies of fits, twitching, and comatose states kicked off the persecution. Furthermore, 6 of those executed were men. They included John Proctor, a wealthy landowner and tavern keeper who was disliked by people in the community, not least because he was outspoken against the trials and then refused to plead guilty. He forgave his accusers before he died and was later immortalized in Arthur Miller's play The Crucible. The only victim not to be killed by hanging was Giles Corey, who was accused of bewitching people with specters. He refused to make any kind of plea in order to protect his son's inheritance and was punished by being crushed to death with large rocks.
We're gonna put this board on you and then we're gonna put a bunch of rocks on top of you and crush you until you plead guilty or not guilty.
His final words are not to be forgotten.
Guilty or innocent?
Wait!
Although Salem became the most notorious, it wasn't the only part of the colonies to experience a witchcraft craze on this level. Witchcraft accusations were leveled in 24 communities in the Massachusetts Bay Area, including Charlestown, Boston, Beverly, Marblehead, Lynn, Malden, and Gloucester. Andover was the most severely affected, with a whopping 1 in 10 people accused. The hysteria became so widespread that even Cotton Mather's father criticized claims of bewitchment by specters, saying accusations needed to be more direct to be credible. One chilling aspect of the accusations was that one of the girls involved in an early wave of the bewitchments named 62 people, with those outside of Salem having no idea why they were incriminated. A Boston-based sailor pointed out that he would have no reason to cast spells against people he didn't know, but it didn't stop him from being convicted and sent to prison. In Andover, people accused their own family members, with lurid accounts of people confessing to flying over treetops to take part in satanic rituals and admitting to pledging their souls to Satan. It's easy to see the events of Salem as an outbreak of hysteria resulting from the deadly cocktail of fundamentalism and ignorance. Yet even Mather, a Harvard graduate, child prodigy, and intellectual who was later a proponent of mass vaccination, published a book describing children in Boston being bewitched, titled Memorable Providences. Other learned minds in the highly literate Bay Colony scrutinized the religious texts, laws, and history surrounding witchcraft and adhered to their own deliberative and bureaucratic procedures. Rather than being an outburst of madness, the Salem trials followed established legal precedents. Perhaps the only aspect of standard practice that was ignored by the Salem trials was that the accusers were not asked for bonds, which demanded a financial commitment and a willingness to defend their stance in court. But Salem was a community dominated by Puritan theology, which stated that being persecuted was a sign of being holy, and that the devil hated you and your righteousness and would torment you through spectral witchcraft. Given that the memories of European persecution were still strong, the sense of being under siege by demonic and human forces alike made sense to a community on the edge. A debunked explanation for the Salem witch trials was contaminated rye. This was based on theories by behavioral scientist Linda Corporeal, who claimed that ergot, a fungus growing on grain that releases lysergic acid when it breaks down, had the same effects as LSD, and therefore caused hallucinations and fits experienced by the girls who made the first witchcraft accusations. There's little evidence to back this up, as the girls' lucid mental states during the trials are inconsistent with the effects of ergot poisoning, including the fact they didn't experience further physical deterioration. They also shared meals with others who didn't share their experiences, and the accusers who did have visions didn't all have the same physical reactions.
Maybe it was the stress from all the dangers in Salem. Maybe they were faking to keep from being punished, but Salem saw it another way.
One piece of analysis from the BBC argues that anti-NMDA receptor encephalitis, a hereditary brain disorder, might have played a role in the girl's anxieties about persecution, spasming limbs, hallucinations, and impaired speech. However, although their symptoms are consistent with modern-day understandings of the disease, they fail to explain similar reactions among others who claim to have been bewitched. The fact that people's physical complaints disappeared once they left the courtroom suggests that their affliction was psychological rather than physical. No one really knows. A witchcraft accusation in Salem was difficult to shake. Evidence couldn't be corroborated due to the Puritan belief in the existence of malignant specters, beings that could be compelled by satanic forces such as witches to harm godly and righteous humans. Because a witch's specters could attack people miles away, alibis were meaningless. Yet a key aspect of Puritan theology was the sanctity of confession. Those in Salem who refused to plead guilty to witchcraft were almost always hanged, while those who confessed were likely to be let off. When they realized the inverted nature of this logic, some of the accused adopted this strategy to escape the hangman's noose. A canny example of this was the enslaved woman Tituba, who confessed to having been visited by the devil and was eventually acquitted.
She's a slave, she's a woman, she knows nobody is gonna stand up for her in this situation, and the kind of smart thing to do is just tell them what they want to hear.
Rebecca Nurse's refusal to admit to a crime sent her to the gallows. People who stayed in jail long enough could weather the storm and potentially accuse other people. Later on, it was accepted that not everyone could be a witch, given how many were accused, particularly when they included elite members of Massachusetts society. In fact, after Salem, the authorities quashed many witchcraft accusations. A number of dogs were accused of witchcraft, and at least 2 were killed. One was accused of bewitching a girl, while another was considered to be under a witch's spell. 2 of the afflicted Salem girls claimed the spirit of an Andover man named John Bradstreet had ridden on top of a dog and caused it great torment. Despite being a supposed victim of Bradstreet, the dog was executed and Bradstreet fled. In another instance, a dog was killed after an Andover girl swore the creature's specter was causing her afflictions. Cotton Mather's father, Increase Mather, pointed out that if the dog had been a demon, then it would almost certainly have been impossible for humans to kill it. The fact that it had been so easy to put the creature down clearly meant it was a normal beast. For many years, it was assumed that Salem's Gallows Hill was the execution site for those convicted in the 1692 witch trials, yet it appears that the hangings actually happened at a spot a quarter of a mile away. The spot was on a ledge overlooking Salem that was visible to as many people as possible, which both added to the victims' humiliation and served as warnings to others about what awaited them if they fell foul of the community. It was named Proctor's Ledge after the grandson of victim John Proctor, who knew the grisly connection his relative had to the land and decided to buy it.
If there was people hanging from a tree right here, they'd be definitely visible.
In 2017, the town erected a memorial to the victims who died there. The names of the dead had become part of the town's efforts to honor and remember what happened. Far from being ignored or belittled, the accusing girls were listened to by the more senior members of the community and came to be seen as witchcraft experts. At the time, female literacy was surprisingly high, and many would have read Mather's book on the subject. The enslaved woman Tituba was even listened to and exonerated, albeit after a long spell in prison. The reason for the testimonies of women being given such an unusual level of attention was largely so that the chaos in Massachusetts could be blamed on something else. The minister Samuel Parris, for example, father of accuser Elizabeth Parris, wanted to believe he was a godly man and that the devil hated him, particularly as he wasn't well liked by various factions of the community. Surprisingly, Puritan women in Salem were allowed to visit the tavern, their only freedom in a restricted life of silence and submission. Witchcraft rumors among tavern women led to accusations that could be fatal. Never before had witch trials been so based on a cohort of young women. Salem was a deeply divided community. Some citizens wanted to set up a breakaway church, and there was a feud between the Putnam and the Porter families, who had different ideas about how religious affairs in the area should be run. More widely within the colony, the events at Salem weren't seen as important for a long time. Members of the colony's provincial council were more worried about French and Native American attacks from the north, as well as epidemics of disease and the loss of their charter in 1684, which meant King James II could establish dominion over New England. These anxieties dovetailed well with Puritan theology, which allowed people to blame social chaos on the devil testing them. Yet the elites of the colony, including Governor William Phips, pardoned people after the early wave of convictions. Writers like Robert Califf wrote books mocking the defenses of witchcraft produced by Increase and Cotton Mather, saying they were an example of, quote, bigoted zeal. The witchcraft convictions were ultimately regarded as politically unsustainable, and the antics in Salem were brought to an end in 1693. One of the more harrowing aspects of the Salem witch trials was that citizens of all backgrounds were being accused and executed. Among those killed in Salem were a 42-year-old Harvard-educated minister, a fortune-telling carpenter, and people with considerable wealth and influence like John Proctor. Rebecca Nurse, one of the first to be hanged, was considered a woman of good standing in the community, but fell foul of the accusations made by Elizabeth Parris and Abigail Williams.
Rebecca Nurse was a Puritan saint. She was a very devout woman, a beloved grandmother, and a staunch pillar of the community here.
On the other end of the scale, the youngest accused witch, Sarah Good's daughter Dorcas, was 4 years old. She went insane after spending most of 1692 in child-sized manacles. Some scholars have even suggested that the wife of the governor, William Phips, was accused of witchcraft. Thomas Brattle, a wealthy merchant, denounced the trials and publicly accused Jonathan Corwin, one of the court officials, of pronouncing judgment on women in the community, but not bringing his own mother-in-law, who amusingly for modern observers was called Margaret Thatcher, to trial when she was named. And when the wife of Minister John Hale was accused, he changed his mind about supporting the trials.
Reverence, tell me, does my wife resemble a witch in your eyes?
In many ways, the story of Salem changed direction when the elites of the colony got involved. This ultimately led to the winding down of the trials, leaving the tragedy and hysteria of Salem in the 1690s to become a grim memory for later generations.